Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to see you again as we begin our next session, which is a panel discussion on the geopolitics of artificial intelligence. Could the race to build the infrastructure that powers AI change the balance of power in the world today? How will it shape the future of global influence? Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, once famously said, quote, "The nation that leads in AI will rule the world." Will it? Is AI the future for any nation that wants to rule the world, that wants to lead the way? Is it the future for all mankind? Please welcome our moderator for this next session, CNN's anchor, Julia Chatterley.
Welcome, everybody. Once again, I'm Julia Chatterley, CNN anchor. It's an honor to be with you. Just to add to that introduction, the US think tank RAND recently said that nations across the globe can see their powers rise or fall depending on how they harness and manage the development of AI. I think we're all very aware that leadership in AI and other emerging technologies is at the very frontier of the geostrategic competition that we see today between the United States and China, and that's only going to intensify. But it's not just about those two economic powers. Many other nations now are seeking to define their place. And there are key building blocks to AI development: compute power, talent, data, physical infrastructure, data centers, and how they're powered. We're going to talk about all of this. All of these things are opportunities. They also can be weaponized in this journey. The question becomes, how do nations balance AI's potential to drive growth and reshape society for the better, while balancing the risks it poses to privacy, security, trust, and maybe even peace? How do we do it? By working competitively, because innovation requires that, collaboratively, all while ensuring no nations get left behind. Enough of me. The good news is my panel know a lot about this, so we're going to talk about it. Let me introduce them. Her Excellency, Dima Aliyaya, Secretary General of the Digital Cooperation Council, Borge Brender, the President of the World Economic Forum, and Jared Cohen, President of Global Affairs at Goldman Sachs. Borge, you're going to kick us off. Define the battleground as you see it today.
I think you were touching on all the important points in your introduction. Both the G2, China and the US, 50% of the global economy, knows that the nation that comes out of this century on top of the new technology will also be the most powerful nation. These are superpowers without superpowers. And I know that a future superpower is Gen AI. And Gen AI, as you alluded to, can be a force for good. It can increase productivity with 10% in the coming decade. That's a lot of prosperity. But I think it's a good idea that the humans are on top of the algorithms and not the algorithms on top of the humans. And what we hope for is that both Beijing and DC will agree on that, and at least can create some guardrails and some traffic rules that can make sure that algorithms don't come out of control. That is, of course, to be seen, but I think we need an agreement on an algorithm above the algorithms, maybe an algorithm that can control that the algorithms do work in the interest of humankind.
We're going to come back to that. The algorithm that controls the algorithm. The ring that powers them all. Jared, your view. Because let's talk about the G2. I'd love, in an ideal world, to have some kind of agreement over what we're doing, but at the same time, everyone sees it as a zero-sum game, slowing down or being cautious. Define the battleground in your mind.
Well, first of all, historically, the US-China tech competition I would have sort of defined it before the public release of ChatGPT and the sort of public debut of generative AI as the US had a 3-decade first mover advantage, and it kind of ended in a tie. And then what generative AI did when it got released to the public in November of 2022 is it gave the United States a lifeline in that technology race because they had put export controls in place the month before we all found out about generative AI on GPUs, which meant that China didn't have enough compute power to run these large language models. For all the obvious reasons that we understand, they don't want to train their own large language models at internet scale. And then the way that China governs their large language models is particularly restrictive. That being said, China is very good at catching up despite some of these challenges. I think that the way that I look at this right now is if you sort of generalize about the debate with regards to generative AI, there's a lot of focus on when will we reach AGI. There's a lot of focus on will open-weighted models win out over closed models. There's probably even more focus on, will the use cases ever justify the enormous spend that's being allocated towards this. Those are all super interesting from my perspective, but not a single one of those is urgent. To me, if I look at the battlefield today, there's only one urgent question, which is if AI software needs to run on AI hardware, can the United States, which currently has the chip advantage, can the United States build enough AI infrastructure to meet all this AI demand by 2027? And the short answer is because the US doesn't have enough differentiated data centers and doesn't have enough baseload power that they can transport to those data centers, meaning not enough powered land, the US is going to have to, if they want to lead in this space, have some kind of an overflow option and allow other countries the chip allocations to supplement that AI demand. And that gets really complicated because every option that the US has where there's cheap energy and the capacity to build fast enough is fraught with pros and cons.
There's opportunity, Your Excellency, when we're talking about building partnerships to build data centers and ultimately how they're powered and the energy to do so. How do you view the battleground, I think, but also the opportunity perhaps that presents for this region?
Definitely, we see that as His Excellency Bourget, and also building on that is the power of AI to be the stabilizer and also leveling the playing field when it comes to progression in productivity, quality of life, creating new jobs, prosperity, or advancing prosperity when it comes to economical growth. The thing is we come to a question, which is, are we including a new AI divide? Who is going to use this technology? And when we look at AI right now, we see an AI powered image created that consumes energy more than charging your smartphone. So if we have huge challenges in developed countries when it comes to consuming AI progression or processing, imagine the countries that do not have reliable energy. Now, that means we're going to leave so much countries behind and a population that will not even use AI, so let alone create their own local content. Looking at computing power as well, where we see regions and we see countries that are investing heavily in computing power. We see in the Middle East more than $3.8 billion has been invested just this year alone, just for computing power. But then, who's going to use that technology? And then we have talents, the shortage of talents. If we're looking at by 2030, we're going to have a shortage of 5 million CPU designers. So how are we going to fulfill the need and the demand going forward? So as important and the opportunity, as big as we see the opportunity, but we do see huge gaps, especially for the South-South region, in terms of energy, capacity building, computing power, and also last but not least, policies and regulations. We still do not have the right standards where we build algorithms on raw, pure, credible data.
There was so much in that. I spoke to the World Bank president recently about AI, and he said, Julia, I'm trying to get 600 million Africans access to electricity. Until they have access to electricity, AI may as well be happening in a parallel universe, to your point. And I think this is a vital point, and we'll talk about it. Borgana, you want to come in on this?
No, exactly building on what you both just said. The jury is, of course, out, but we know from the platform economy that the winner took it all. The big platforms were the winners, and they're still the winners. How will this play out on AI? I think in the hardware phase that we are now, it seems like those that have the resources, the money to invest, have the best possibilities to be successful, combined also, of course, with electricity. And to this digital divide and the global south, I'm very concerned. In Africa, 20% of the population have access to internet.
Yeah.
And how can you then be part of this revolution? One thing is that you don't have access to electricity, then you don't have access to the internet. And there is so many young people, very tech-savvy people. We just have to make sure that also AI and the new technologies can be an equalizer, because potentially it can be on health, access in rural areas, on education. You can follow a Harvard professor teaching through the modern technology. And to also add to what we spoke about on the G2 and the really tough competition that we are seeing now, and it will increase the competition in the coming years, I do hope, though, that there is enough self-interest, and they see that it is in their self-interest from the big players to agree on some traffic rules. Don't forget, after the Second World War, we did agree on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we have been relatively successful, at least until recently. I see that the power of AI can be so much for good, something that nuclear weapons have never been, but we also have to make sure that we don't lose the baby with the bathwater, and 10 trillion US dollars can be lost annually in cyber crime by 2025. And I think both China and the US have to agree that that is not a good use of money. That should be stopped now.
I think your point is very important, to bring it back to the geopolitics and that the vying for power in this, because social instability in nations that get left behind is a problem for all, not just those regions as we see around the world. And I think this is vitally important. I would push back on the nuclear situation, that it took decades to reach treaties and agreements over that, which is, we don't have that, I think, is the important point in AI. Take it back to the time frame, Jared. I think this is important. And what does the United States have, and how does it pick its partners? Because as you said, that's complicated. And then I want to ask the question about China too, because what do they lack now that they also need? Because everybody's going to be grabbing for what they need. And that's how alliances are formed in this sphere in particular.
So I think the way to break this down is ask the question, what is the technical problem that needs to be solved? Because we can speculate about, good use cases, bad use cases. We can speculate about treaties, all these things. But there's an actual technical problem that is going to play out over the next 18 to 24 months. And it starts with, just the fundamental difference between the requirements for AI workloads versus cloud workloads, which have, in the case of the latter, has kind of defined the last chapter of AI. For these AI workloads, the data centers that are required to power them are, they're ultra high density, and they require a single concentrated source of power. And so intermittent power like wind and solar can't be used for it. It requires 24/7 power. And so what it means is you need base load power. So you think coal, nuclear, natural gas as the only viable options. Nuclear is not pragmatic in this time frame, even though it's quite obviously the right solution.
How much?
So,
can you quantify this?
So I'll put this in perspective. So there's 8,000 data centers worldwide. There's 3,000, roughly 3,000+ data centers in the US. Last year, the US required about 17 gigawatts of power to run those data centers. There's lots of different estimates, and the range is sort of astonishing, but it kind of nets out at by 2027, the US needs to bring another 35 to 60 gigawatts of additional baseload power online in order to meet AI demand. And by the way, the US actually has enough natural gas to do this, but it's in North Dakota, it's in all these other places, and it's prohibitively expensive to transport it to where the data centers need to be built or are located, and it's politically fraught because it has to go through all of these different political jurisdictions that are pushing back for ESG reasons. But even if you solved all of that, the US has another problem, which is of those 3,000 data centers, there's less than 2% vacancy rates in the US. And so you don't have enough vacancies to incorporate a sufficient amount of AI workloads. But even if you wanted to, even if you had enough vacancies in existing US data centers, it's the wrong engineering architecture because it doesn't have the liquid cooling capacity, and they're not designed in a way to manage this sort of very heavy, again, ultra high density compute.
Okay, we get it. Where do they need to go?
So,
so
the US basically has 3 options, and honestly, none of them represents a panacea to this problem. One option is, the US will want to bias towards kind of keeping it in the democratic world. So think Canada, Australia, the Nordic countries, France, the Netherlands, Germany. There will be some effort in that direction, but a lot of the problems that I just articulated are problems that are also persistent in those countries. There's other options, which is you just go where there's cheap baseload power and a track record of hyperscalers, for instance, building data centers. So think Malaysia and Indonesia. The problem there is geopolitical, right? So with cloud workloads, there's a little more comfort with that capacity being distributed. When you're talking about AI workloads, the US government is very uncomfortable with that capacity ending up in China. And there's just a feeling that for Malaysia and Indonesia, as 2 examples, there's just a discomfort with data centers being built there for AI workloads because it goes straight to China. So here we are in the Middle East. To me, this remains the most viable option. The Middle East obviously has tremendous abundance of cheap energy. There's no region that knows how to do massive infrastructure projects at scale and very quickly. There's plenty of land. It's right near the water for liquid cooling. A lot of the desalination technology can be repurposed for that. There's regulatory ecosystems that the governments control. And most importantly, each one of the countries here has the geopolitical ambitions to rightly see a once-in-a-generation opportunity to seize the moment. And so I like to say, if sort of data is the new oil, when it comes to AI or generative AI, it's actually nations, not nature, that are going to determine where all of that capacity is.
I mean, China sees this opportunity in the Middle East as well. Okay, you're nodding as he was speaking.
Yeah, I agree with what my friend Jared here is saying. I think the silver lining we could see, though, when it comes to energy is that you can, of course, use renewables, solar and wind, but you have to have something in reserve when the sun is not there and when the wind is not blowing. So if you have an LNG or a gas-fired power plant ready to start when there is less sun. And of course, we will also see big changes here in the coming years on the battery capacity and also the price then for store this. But in the coming years, I agree with Jared, you have to have access to competitive, cheap electricity. Hopefully, I think it should be renewables, but you have to have a backup, being hydro. Nuclear will take time, but of course, with gas, what we have a lot of here in Qatar is, of course, a lot more preferred than if it's coal in some other places, because that emits double amount of CO2 emissions. That's not really what our planet now needs.
This is going to blow us way off target on sustainability targets. You're smiling, but we all know it. Everyone on this stage. Yeah, just checking that. Because that also has
I'm not smiling. I'm a bit depressed, I have to admit.
Yeah, I know. It's sort of smiling through the tears. But that also has huge geopolitical consequences as well. Your Excellency, you wanted to weigh in there.
Well, definitely, I was nodding when Jared mentioned the Middle East. I see there is great potential, definitely affordable energy, but also the geopolitical location of the GCC is very unique as well. It is a connector between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Also, it's very rich when it comes to its submarine cables as well. We know that Oman itself has 20 submarine cables. And that gives a huge opportunity when it comes to a robust, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure in the region. So definitely the potential is vital here in the Gulf, and also when it comes to their geopolitical relationships. Also with the other regions, it gives them the competitive advantage to be an innovation hub for the region and connecting the East with the West when it comes to talent and innovation progression. I think to the challenge, which is the AI divide, that it is increasing. We really need to look at multilateralism in a different perspective. The only way to solve these challenges is with multilateralism and with cooperation. And this is where we identify what is the competitive advantage of a country that can be a solution for a challenge in another country. And that was very clear in a lot of our initiatives that we have launched, especially with WEF lately, where we launched the Digital FDI initiative. And it gave us a very clear perspective of what is the uniqueness of every country. And how can we attract, or we connect the supply with the demand, which is the private sector investors with the country to progress that transformation. We have seen it in Pakistan, Rwanda, and now we're working with Cyprus and Oman. And that will create a lot of opportunity for countries to align on new ways of triple P engagements as well. New models of how can we identify where is the brain power, where is the powerful infrastructure, and come up with models for cross-border expansion that will enable local content and local innovation to prosper. And then we will have multiple options when it comes to AI.
Yeah, I mean, the economies of scale potential in that, and strategically looking around the world and saying who has the young talent, who has the energy provision, and optimizing that sounds great, except no one wants to be reliant on and for a supply chain for certain parts of this that could increasingly become contentious. And that's the challenge. You sort of have to pick sides. You have to use, it's data diplomacy or data center diplomacy, but it's in all of these spheres, be it chips, be it data, be it data centers, whatever it is in this value chain.
So if I can chime in on this, the point about supply chains and not being reliant on kind of any one country or any one company, the challenge is we're actually geopolitically pregnant on this, we're economically pregnant on this. I mean, so I'll just give you one example. 93% of high-end chips in the world come from Taiwan. Okay. TSMC accounts for 6 to 13% of daily energy consumption on the island of Taiwan, and Taiwan imports more than 98% of its energy resources. If the TSMC plant has to shut down, it can take up to 6 to 8 weeks to start it back up, right? So you think about all the dynamics in the Taiwan Strait and the Far East. Everyone sort of jumps straight to the nightmare solution without thinking about sort of much lower hanging fruit ways to prevent that energy from entering the island. So that's one choke point that I worry about. But even if you go to the Netherlands, so ASML, which creates the machines for extreme ultraviolet lithography, which basically maps out the wafers that are used to produce sub-5 nanometer chips. They have 100% of the supply chain on that technology, and you cannot produce a sub-5 nanometer chip without that technology. ASML is 100% reliant on a German company called Zeit, which produces the mirrors that go into that, which is 100% reliant on another piece of machinery in North Carolina that they rely on for that. And so when there's something like a hurricane in the US, and that company in North Carolina gets knocked offline, it actually has an impact on TSMC supply chain. So we put ourselves in this complicated web of supply chains, which for the US on the one hand, and for Taiwan on the other hand, it makes it so it's very difficult for anybody to be able to diversify away from TSMC because of these complicated supply chains. On the other hand, it makes the entire world vulnerable to any part of the value chain getting disrupted because there's just such a single concentration for high-end chips.
A nation's going to fight over this in the future if we're not very careful, to your point.
Yeah, we are already seeing more nearshoring, but we're also seeing more friendshoring. You want to source your input factors from countries that you feel are friendly.
But it also takes time to build capacity. I mean, the United States is trying to do it, but it takes time.
It does. And I think what COVID learned us was that just in time is not enough. Also just in case, but also the diversification is incredibly important. There is not a good idea to get 90% of something the whole world needs from one place, be it antibiotics, be it ships, be it also other things that are key for our modern lives. So still, I think that global trade, a win-win thinking, creates growth and prosperity, but we also have to adjust for global value chains being, and we have to pay a bit of a price for that to be more resilient. But that is like you also pay insurance for your house, for your car, and we ignore that insurance premium for decades, and that's what we have to build now. At the same time, though, that we have to do this, we're seeing a paradigm change in the consumption demand. So, traditional goods has almost peaked. That's why countries that are big manufacturer of goods do have now a big supply and overproduction, while what is really growing, the demand, is digital trade and services. Digital trade and services are now growing 3 times as fast as traditional goods. And this means that those that are well positioned in these areas are also the countries that are going to be much more prosperous in the years to come. So this also means that you have to increase the capacity in these areas a lot. So it's an exciting time, and we're going to see a lot of pivoting in the years to come. But I hope, though, that we still will have an approach that is like prosper your neighbor instead of beggar your neighbor. I think that still should be the basic approach.
Is that realistic?
I think that we still will see an increase in global trade in the years to come. Like this year, we expect 3% growth in global trade. We expect maybe even more next year. And that is in a situation where we're talking about trade wars and tariffs and all this. I think that trade will still grow, but it will not be the engine of growth in the same way it was for decades. So maybe that can lead, unfortunately, to a situation where we see lower trend growth in the years to come. But to argue against that, I would say, I think we already are seeing the growth, extraordinary growth that will come from the new technologies. Why is the US not landing at all? Last year when we were here in Doha, we said, oh, is it going to be a hard landing or a soft landing? And there's no landing. The economy is still growing so much. And I'm reflecting on how come is the economy still growing so much with that high interest rate to get down inflation? It is because we are seeing the productivity gains from the new technologies already. So it has also a deflation effect on the economy.
I think your point is very valid, because there is a suggestion that some of the restrictions that we've seen on these technologies are for national security reasons, but what you're arguing is it's the economic security reasons that make it so important that you act in your own best interests, perhaps before you act in the collective interest, which I think is the fear here. Jared?
So Berge is right that we started off the year talking about the prospect of an economic soft landing, and you're right, now we're not talking about any landing, but the thing I'm concerned about is a geopolitical hard landing that gets in the way of all of this. And so what could cause that? Before COVID, there was always a tension between the US and China around technology. You remember 5G and so forth, but you could always count on the economic interests of both the United States and China tempering the geopolitics. And then COVID happened, and the script completely flipped. We had this paradigmatic shift where now it's the domestic circumstances in both China and the United States that are driving short-term geopolitical thinking at the expense of medium and long-term economic consequences. And so we're treating this relationship between the United States and China as if it's a Cold War.
Well, it's zero sum.
And that's what I mean. We're applying zero-sum thinking to a situation where China is America's third largest trading partner. The Soviet Union was never economically intertwined with the United States in the same way. And so, but because we don't have a framework for making sense of a competitive coexistence for countries that are so economically intertwined that have economies this size, we're defaulting to a framework that we're familiar with from history. And this is what I mean by a geopolitical hard landing, which is if both countries do make decisions in service of short-term geopolitical thinking that causes economic harm on both sides, that's how we end up messing all of this up. And I think we're actually headed on a course in that direction by trying to sort of provoke this supply chain escalation and diversify supply chains that don't meet the economic realities to do so.
Which is exactly what you were saying earlier.
Exactly, and I wanted to double down more on going back to the self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
Now, and the value chain. Can any country be self-sufficient digitally? I think that's impossible as of now because of a lot of dynamics, either GDP, either population, either geographic location, either if you look at Pakistan itself, their urban demographics is stone mountains. How are you going to enable 100% connectivity when fiber optics, for instance? So therefore, there has to be reliance on one another to create that supply chain. But the thing is, we see you have asked a very important question. Can that happen? Well, I see that with new modules of multilateralism and cooperation, it can be more in the developing countries because they have the interest and the intention for them to expedite their digital transformation. It's a huge agenda for one country to take alone, from connectivity to cloud computing to human capital development, reforms in policies and regulation. No country can do this alone, especially in the South-South. Therefore, new ways and means of collaboration can be adopted. We see it on ground now. Just an example, for instance, we see Rwanda being an amazing example for an emerging innovation hub in Africa. It's 99% connected as a country. All government services is online. But you have a very small percentage of population, which is 13%, that use internet. Why? Because the affordability of devices and the service itself. But you have a country like Pakistan and Oman, whom are maker countries, and they have companies that produce low-cost devices. By creating very innovative policies and regulations, as well as PPP engagement, we have managed to connect these companies with the government of Rwanda to create new agreements of supply and also subscription-based that enabled 3% more of the population to be online. So do we see that cooperation happening? I truly believe that by innovating in policies and regulations and modules, we can have that happen by securing or balancing, let's say, openness with national security as well, and finding that
the balance.
The balance, exactly.
I mean, there's so many layers here. There's the provision of energy, there's connectivity, there's the baseline digitization that you're talking about, and then we're, in a way, above that, the provision of artificial intelligence of the emerging technologies, and then you build content on top of that. So it's these multi-layers. Jared, I want to go back to what you were saying, because I think we do need to have, as part of this conversation, and we'll get back to it at the end, how we build on that and collectively come together and work out what's best for all and how we manage this. But I do think what you're saying is that we're at a critical juncture over the next 12 to 18 months, and you were saying that you worry about this sort of geopolitical hard landing and what creates that. How do we step back from that at this moment, and who is the best body to perhaps convene and have that conversation? Because I think there's a danger of being perhaps alarmist, and we can talk about whether we're overemphasizing how much compute power we're going to need in this sort of smash and grab situation that we're in, and the probability of that. But I do think, And certainly I sense it from those that I speak to in the business community that we're building to some pretty dangerous crescendo, and it will have consequences for all. So how do we take a step back? How do we bring people together to at least discuss and acknowledge what has to happen and what can happen without coming to some bigger form of conflict, particularly when the backdrop is what we're expecting over the next 6 to 12 months is perhaps tighter controls on technology and tariffs and other issues between the sort of G2 nations. That was a long question. I apologize for that.
But it was very good. It was a very good question.
Thank you.
I'll make a deal with you. I'll be a
You'll
little
be shorter.
I'll be I'll be shorter too, but I'll be a little more alarmist, but with a prescription.
Thank you.
So I'm deeply skeptical that you can regulate any of this in any meaningful way. Look at how hard a time we had regulating the last chapter of technology. It's just, last time it was a seemingly intractable problem, but there was a path to do it if the will was there. This time it's not clear to me that there's an obvious way forward. I have total lack of confidence in any incumbent international institution or multilateral organization to be able to have the authority and the credibility to be able to do this.
Borge begs to differ. He's like, how dare
except
you?
Except the World Economic Forum,
Thank you.
obviously.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. But here's where I'll be a little more prescriptive, because I think we have to be honest about how all of this is done, and it's being done bilaterally and kind of through these ad hoc coalitions of countries. What we've seen is countries have actually found ways to band together on an ad hoc basis to do protectionism. Right, you've seen it with the sort of the Chips 4 and others, right? But where I think there's a prescriptive opportunity actually comes not from the great powers, right? With all this sort of talk about a return to great power competition, all it's really brought us is a lot of great power complaining as well. I have this thesis that if U.S.-China tensions persist in getting worse for longer, it's creating space for smaller countries that have a differentiated part of the supply chain, an abundant amount of flexible capital, and are led by leaders that have a global agenda that's independent of Washington and Beijing, to emerge and play this role of geopolitical swing states. To the point that you made before, this is too important, and Borge, you also made the point that it doesn't suit anybody's interests to just continue escalating. It's actually these smaller geopolitical swing states that have the credibility, either individually or on an ad hoc basis, to play a more reasonable role and carve out almost kind of a moderating path forward here, because in a world where the US and China are in a competitive coexistence, neither country can gain the upper hand without relying on other countries.
Okay, so it's the moderating force of the other nations that are required in this process, perhaps. The sort of middle nations that play a key role
I like
here.
geopolitical swing states more than middle nations.
I think it's a sexier term. Can I very quickly ask about the companies that are involved here as well? Because they're spending billions of dollars, and these are big nations, middle nations, geopolitical powers in themselves with the scale and the size that they have. They also need to play a role in how we manage this. The big AI driving companies, the Microsofts of the world, the XAI of obviously Elon Musk, OpenAI with Sam Altman. These guys have to be part of this conversation too. Who controls them and that? No one is your answer.
Well,
quickly, and then Borge's going to talk.
No, Borge, you should jump in. They're all important strategic partners of the World Economic Forum. But my personal take on this is what's new relative, again, to other chapters of geopolitics is the incredibly powerful voice that private sector companies have.
Right.
When we talk about non-state actors, I think it almost trivializes the outsized role that companies have to kind of put them in this blanket category of non-state actors. They're whispering in the ears of companies. They are showing up with enormous amounts of resources from unregulated ecosystems, and we've never had a chapter in any era of history where you've had so many private sector voices from very mature companies to frankly very nascent companies and everything in between, playing a critical role in shaping how all of this evolves from a geopolitical perspective.
Can I ask you whether you think that the geopolitical swing states that wield power in this environment, as we've discussed, can be a moderating force on the United States and China? To your point about the equality required, that no nation gets left behind, all the things that you're fighting for, Can they be that force?
Oh, definitely. I truly believe that, and that's the essence why like-minded nations came together to create organizations or agreements together, betting on digital economy being the economy of the future, and not accepting to be put in a position where they have to take sides, and not be put in a position where they have to be consumers and not producers, and create their own destiny and have their seat on the table when it comes to the semiconductor supply chain, or when it comes to AI regulation and policy, and their voices have to be heard. DCO is an outcome of such kind of agreements. And talking about private sector also, we truly believe that the private sector as innovators have to have a seat on the table. They have to be part of the discussion. We have to co-create and co-design these policies and regulations together for the benefit, at the end of the day, for the benefit of the people and the benefit of the citizens. They have to be part of creating the local content, providing the knowledge, and also innovating when it comes to the foresight of what's coming next.
Okay, I'm very conscious we have 3 minutes left. We have to wrap this up because I've promised to be on time. Maybe we can wiggle it a little bit. What do we need to see today to manage the geopolitical risk? If you could give your advice based on everything that you see, you hear, the needs, the demands that are required, what would you say?
So we're definitely faced with a geopolitical recession. We are in the middle of a geopolitical recession. But what has been surprising so far is that the economy has been very resilient. We thought, how could the global economy come back again with 3.2% global growth when there is a war in Ukraine, there is an escalation of the conflicts also in the Middle East. We also have tension in the South China Sea. I do hope that in the years to come, we will see no further escalation of these conflicts. Then I think we can get back on track on trend growth that is closer to 4%, underpinned by the new technologies, because they are a big game changer. I think also you're right that the private sector has a critical role to play. Why am I saying that? First, governments are so indebted. We've never seen this kind of governmental debt since the Second World War, and some nations haven't been so indebted since the Napoleonic Wars, and that's quite a few years ago. So you alluded to this global private superpowers, and we will need to bring them also into the discussion, and other key players. If we are going to see any kind of traffic rules being established, it has to be in a multi-stakeholder fashion. But there are also some silver linings. Look at the meeting in Peru where President Biden and Xi Jinping at least agreed that AI has nothing to do with nuclear weapons and the way there are decisions made in that context. Of course, it should be very obvious, but the fact that they agreed on this shows that we have to be so hyper vigilant that these new technologies also have aspects that we maybe are not so conscious about today.
Yeah,
so
they can,
I would
they
say
can be weaponized in other ways. Jared, you're a skeptic.
Well, I'll finish where I
Be
start.
optimistic for me.
This is actually not skeptical. This is I'll finish where I started, which is I said that where this was all going to come to a head is around the urgent known unknown, which is where all of this AI infrastructure is going to be built to meet the demand. And I've always believed that we innovate best when there's necessity. And if necessity drives innovation, I think ultimately we figure all this out because in the next 12 to 24 months, we're going to have to, right? And as we get closer and closer to that breaking point, that's when the politics, tends to take a little bit more of a sideline.
Your Excellency, how do you incentivize all players to act in a collective interest rather than self-interest? Because that's the key.
The need the urgency and the need to change and to prosper very quickly. And that's why we see now ministers of communication, IT, and other ministers being pressured by their leaders to expedite their growth and transformation. And that will not happen without cooperation and learning from best practices of other countries and nations, and reaching out to private sector to get this help and support in terms of investment, as well as growing their national champions when it comes to technology and expand their market. I truly believe that in all this geopolitical challenges, the South is going to surprise you. They are going to be the innovation powerhouse of the future, and we have to really focus on them and provide them all the enablers that they need for them to grow and prosper.
I love that message. Final sentence, because I cut you off. You were going to say something.
No, I just build on that. I think we should end on an optimistic, positive note. Look at India. India is today the fastest growing of the large economies in the world. And why is that? They introduced a digital ID a few years ago. 1.4 billion people, almost everyone has access to the internet, and it almost doesn't cost anything to use it on your cell, and the economy is growing so fast, and you're seeing though digital trade and services exploding. That shows that don't underestimate the global south in this if there is access.
Love it. Your panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for helping us take a little break here. And on this positive note, thanks to you, Julia, for moderating this session. Just a quick word to say we will take a 30-minute break and reconvene at 3:45 sharp for our closing session, where we will have some of the highest profile guests here at the forum. Joining us on stage for a panel discussion, the President of the Dominican Republic, the President of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Prime Minister of Egypt. We will also have closing remarks from the President of the UN General Assembly and Dr. Mohammed Al-Khulaifi, Minister of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. So we'll see you back here in 30 minutes.